Hi, I'm Margaret Herring.
I'm Meera Kolluri.
I'm Grant Lattanzi.
And I'm Camille Alejandro, and we're the CCT 506 Solid Group. We talked about the Solid technology with Dr. Meg Jones, and here are a few highlights.
Solid is a shortened version of social linked data. Our core technical component are solid pods or personal online data stores, which are simply where data is stored in Solid. And they are not coupled. Though they can be provided by corporations, they aren't coupled with the corporations or institutions or governments that are providing different web services or apps.
As you interact with a service like Facebook, your data is written to their servers. And so that kind of makes sense that the data is stored there. But with pods, we were interested in how a person could have their data stored on their personal server and how apps could interact with and write data to a decentralized server.
And now you'll be hearing from Dr. Meg Jones.
I think this is how Solid is presented. It's kind of like, we're going to create this intermediary between the user and the company that has all the data. Like, we're going to uncouple that. Here's where I'm going to manage all of my permissions about what data goes where and why. And now we're moving that labor to pod. It's going to now be where that labor exists.
The use of the word autonomous in that research statement to say now the individual has a choice to opt into it or has an awareness that maybe acts as not our fault anymore if there's misuse or misjudgment of the data. To replace just the term users, we didn't want to give the individuals that interact with solid pods a blanket statement of just they exist in the universe and they kind of get thrown around in there, which is arguably the reality of how their data is being thrown around and used and monetized currently. But solid pods in the way that it was marketed was to say we're not only decentralizing data organization, but we're also taking the burden off of companies, and we're also giving autonomy to the user, and we're also giving developers more exciting and transparent systems that they can work with. So it seemed to be the blanket fix or the blanket celebration that was accessible to all three.
The way it's marketed, does it use the word autonomous a lot? And does the marketing materials use user, or do they use another word? I know you chose to put autonomous, private, and individual to kind of remove that level of marketing from your own presentation, but how was it marketed?
I think user, and I don't know that the emphasis was put on autonomy so much as we have, but I think there's a lot of emphasis on ownership.
So there were three communities that Sir Tim Berners-Lee and John Bruce sort of called out in the web environment. So as users claimed that users want more choice and privacy. So that would be equated to like what we call autonomous private individuals. And then second, there were organizations, and they claimed that they wanted more focus and freedom to operate. So focusing on the primary functions of their apps rather than data management and ownership and servers. Third, developers. So developers want to create exciting data independent applications. So again, focusing on what they actually want to do rather than the data management side.
So I'm really keyed to these little language moves, but my work highlights the way that US tech policy calls us consumers, not users, which is different in other countries where data subjects were users. And sometimes in US policy, we're users, all that comes with loaded identities, like act those out. And we have expectations as consumers that we may or may not have as users. And so I'm really listening for those keywords as this pivotal moment in tech transformation is happening. So that's why I asked that and why I'm paying particular attention to it. And something like Solid, I'm trying to, that's really, really helpful. Like the organizations, the users, like the entities at play are certainly beyond the commercial. See that? And that's like, to me, an obvious reality that like pods could be nonprofits. Like Mozilla would have a pod, right? That seems, of course, you'd have a couple of nonprofits that would be in this game, but I also assume Facebook would have a pod. They have a huge amount of talent in their umbrella now that does all that data management stuff, right? That Solid's like, hey, you should use this. We'll take that off your hands. And I'm sure Facebook's like, well, we already kind of, paid for that, right? We've already said that this is not helpful at this point to us. And I'm curious about on this particular thread, when I look at this map, I wonder wonder about what futures you see for the entities that you just described. How does this really play out? Who are the pods? Like Facebook has a pod, and the Facebook pod really works best with the Facebook app, right? And you get these incentives. They're partnered with these people who give you these benefits. And if you want the opportunity to, whatever incentivizes people to use this stuff, right? Like there's a million different versions in our last 20-year history of incentivizing and creating network effects, right? Like Apple locks down ecosystem to provide certain conveniences, but to also protect you from doing stupid things and downloading junk apps, protect you from yourself, right? Like we spend a lot of money on Apple products that protect us from ourselves and are shiny and pretty. And so the version of this that I really think Berners-Lee wants to avoid that version. And so I'm wondering how this ecosystem prevents that. Like, is there some alternative future where he wins this game?
Well, I will say it's interesting because I think maybe two of our questions we had pretty much the same questions for you. We were curious where you saw kind of this going. But I think that really the kind of thinking about it in that way with, all the different players having their own pod service and then the marketing machines kicking into gear and people finding what pod is best. It makes me think about the importance of the self-hosts and how maybe that could be, if that were to be a common practice with Solid, is it likely to be? I don't know, because even now it's just not very accessible language. My background's in sociology, so this was all very new for me. And so I don't know how likely it is that people will take the time to go learn how to host a pod and if they need to buy a new hardware or have better, more stable internet or something like that. That is an element of it that could be promising, but then it's the question of, okay, who's teaching them to self-host? Is it like saying like, oh, you need this product to self-host? And then it's sort of just the cycle begins anew. It's still definitely in its infancy, but I think it is, if any of us wanted to, we could start using it.
I wonder if we could start a pod when we're all like really good at using other people's servers. And if this company could make it really easy to set up your own server, go in and out of these like versions of shared and personal computing. But maybe we should try to set up a pod. I'm most intrigued by the revolutionary language of this. They're like, here's a new World Wide Web. But it all sounds the same in so many ways. You're taking the burden off of companies that are doing this data heavy and giving users ownership, meaning that you're shifting that burden to users, which is basically just what we've been doing this whole time. I'm not sure how much game changing I see here. Does the ownership language, is that powerful in a way that I don't see based on my sort of reading of it that I just described to you guys? Like, is ownership problematic here, or do you find it empowering?
To me, it sounds like instead of just having a bunch of scattered papers throughout my apartment, I have one locked filing cabinet and I have the key, and I get to decide who can go into my files and who can't.
This podcast was brought to you by the CCT 506 Spring 2021 Solid Group, instructed by Dr. J.R. Osborn at Georgetown University.